mean, in between causes and conditions, it is used really a little bit loosely. I mean, we could say that, say, experience in right now, the cause is that we were born. Okay, and then there are various other conditions, that you've come to live in Thailand and that you've come here today, and so on and so forth. So you have sort of a basic kind of cause and conditions. How the effects are, well, yeah, I don't know whether I can distinguish those in the same way. I mean, it was a certain, let's say, if you were a kind and peaceful person, but you were living in a warlike environment, culture for some reason, then you might be considered to be crazy or be an outcast. Whereas if you were a very aggressive person, then you'll be one of the lads. But then if you were a very violent and aggressive person, you went to live in a Buddhist monastery, then you'd probably have a more difficult time. So there are the inner causes and conditions, and then you have the external environment, to what extent they are they resonate, or they're supported or exaggerated, and so this does relate to the fact that the Buddha's teaching, in the time of the Buddha, was called the Dhamma Vinaya, rather than Buddhism. There was no words, it's Buddhism. So the Dhamma is sort of all the inner teachings of spiritual development, and the Vinaya regards creating the optimum external conditions for that development to take place. So it isn't an idea of just a complete internal kind of thing. You just make your mind peaceful and then you won't suffer with anything. But there is this idea that you try to create the kind of families and communities and societies in which are enabling people or helping people to develop positive qualities and abandon unwholesome qualities. So the question comes, say like in a country like Thailand, which is at least superficially sort of a Buddhist country, to what extent does the environment and the culture and the structures actually encourage the flourishing of Buddhist values? Probably not very much these days, I would think.
This one's for my sister. She has a child who she feels strongly is gifted, and she constantly praises her child, although the child's only about a year and a few months old. She's constantly praising her child out of excitement and joy to all of us. And I told her that I feel it would be in the best interest of the child if she didn't do that. Relating it to your response in your previous talk in Bangkok, I think you gave some reasons perhaps for that, and I couldn't remember what the reasons are.
Well, I think for small children, I mean, just absolute unconditional love and praise is fine. But when children get a little bit older, then the question of motivation and praise and so on becomes a little bit more complex, because if you praise children for being smart, for instance, and children begin to feel that's a gift that they possess, then they become kind of possessive of it and afraid of losing it, because it becomes part of who they are. So often children who believe they have this gift of being smart and intelligent will be a lot more less likely to take intellectual risks and to what they call thinking out of the box, because there's too much to lose. If they're failure, then it affects their sense of who they are. And in one experiment in Harvard, where they asked students whether they thought they were smart, And then following this, they gave them a test in which they made it easy to cheat. And the percentage of kids students who said they were smart, who cheated, was much higher than the students who don't, because they're afraid. If they don't pass their exam, then it means they're not really smart after all. And it's a sort of identity crisis. So the alternative to that is to praise effort, and to praise not what somebody is, but what they do. And which is very much like the Buddhist. It's not what you believe or what you think you are. It's what you do, what you say, how you use your mind. So if a child does as well an exam, or you must have really put a lot of work into that. That's really praiseworthy. You really try very hard at work, don't you? Or look, you've put so much. So praising that kind of thing doesn't have any ill effect. So if a child, if for some reason or another, fails in an exam, then they will generally conclude that they didn't put enough effort in, and that next time they'll try harder. So they don't have, it's not sort of this major kind of crisis that maybe they're not so smart after all. It's just a matter of effort. So yeah, the way that we pray, and particularly words from parents, have an incredible weight and significance with children, and it does affect them right through their lives, doesn't it? But that's an ideal, and I think sometimes parents, you can't help it. You just sort of proud of your children, and it's not going to be 100%. But I think that it is important to let children know that even if their love of the parents is not conditioned by being a certain way or doing something, but that's basically that love will be there whatever happens.
I was a trip to Sri Lanka for vacation. I noticed Sri Lanka is a country where a lot of Muslims came from, right? Therefore, it's an interesting trip. So I noticed that the still religion exists, however, much less other religions are taking over populations, other cultures, other beliefs are taking over. Give me the perception, perhaps, that there were some followers of the tradition that were lost in other religions. And give me also an idea of what happened in other countries closer to Thailand, Malaysia, or other Southeast Asian countries that lost some of the traditions, and therefore why did that happen? Knowing, of course, that it's very logical, very pragmatical. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, there may be some part of that due to particular nature of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. I mean, as you know, there were successive waves of colonization, and the Portuguese, the first wave, were particularly brutal and forced people to even change their surnames. That's why to this day Sri Lankan people have Portuguese surnames, and made quite a brutal attempt to eradicate Buddhist culture using power of arms and violence. And then the Dutch were the second wave, and they were perhaps not quite so bloodthirsty, but they again exerted. The British tend to be more subtle, and you can only get a good job in the civil service if you've been through a Christian school and that kind of thing. So they have this kind of superficial kind of justice, but and there were, even within the British colonial period, you had periods where the sort of more evangelical Christians were stronger, but then that led in Sri Lanka to the revival of Buddhism, which was ironically due in some part to American Buddhists, Colonel Olcott and people like this. And so in Sri Lanka, you had this, it was called like scientific Buddhism, which in the late 19th century, the way that the Sri Lankans revived Buddhism through opposition to Christian missionary efforts was to stress the kind of rational side of Buddhism, as opposed to the kind of more irrational side of Christianity. And so that became a particular kind of presentation of the Buddhist. Buddhism is scientific, it's not like Christianity, that kind of idea, which sometimes we just went too far that way. But in prior to, and apart from that, the British brought a lot of Tamils to work on plantations. So you had the northern part became more Hindu. You have Muslims as well. You had the Christian missionaries. So you have a small island. It's pretty difficult. The only place you can go is into the middle. So like the Buddhist heartland is right in the center of the island, and all around the edges was affected. But if we look in Southeast Asia as a whole, then there are not only religious or cultural influences. For instance, in this part of the world, the whole idea was that nature is boundless. Wherever you go, it's just forest in every direction. And so in Southeast Asian history, you don't get this idea of kings waging war in order to get territory, because why? It's just more forest. So when you have a war, what you want is people. So you have a war in the old days in Southeast Asia. You want as few people to die as possible, and you want as many prisoners as possible. So wars didn't tend to be very bloodthirsty. And the ideal is if you can get the king of both countries to have a combat on an elephant, so that only one person dies, and then you can take all their people, and then you can give them a piece of land, take them back to your country, give them a piece of land to cultivate, and then you can get the taxes, and then they can be your soldiers when there's a war. And when they would take over a city, there's no idea of, you want that city, like when the Burmese took over Ayutthaya, all you want to do is steal as much as you can, and then after a few days of rampage, you go home again with all your treasures. So people would, knowing that their city was being besieged and it wasn't likely to survive, everybody would just go off into the forest for a few days and leave them to it, and then when they've gone home again, you go back home. So this were the sort of ideas of, and then the Westerners came, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and they have a whole different. Once they've got far more advanced military technologies, and secondly, they're into killing everybody. They don't want prisoners to take off home. They just want to kill everybody, and then when they go and move into your city, they stay there. So they were completely flummoxed by this, and this was how quite a small number of Western soldiers and mercenaries and people were able to rapidly expand their power base through Southeast Asia in 16th, 17th century. So, we're always looking at, there's a complex of factors, and the particular nature of Buddhism. We can say, well, yeah, if we look at the Turkish invasion, Muslim invasion of India in 1,000 more years ago, then the fact that all the monks were completely passive, and they just came in and just killed all the monks, and the monks didn't fight back. Well, yes, then the particular nature of Buddhism, or Buddhist monasticism, did make it easy for people to take over. But on the bigger picture, then that's just sort of one strand of what went on. One more question before the รู้ยังไงว่าถูกต้องนะ ตอบภาษาอังกฤษนะ
What was the question? I couldn't hear.
How do you know if your practice is proceeding correctly? Well, one very simple rule of thumb is, again, if you observe that if you don't practice or before you practice, it's very easy to suffer and not so easy to be happy. And your happiness tends to be very brittle and easily destroyed. The suffering tends to last longer. So if you're practicing correctly, then the number of things that make you suffer should get less, and the number of things that make you happy should increase. So that's a good sign that you're doing something right, so without getting into too many technical details, I think so. There. จากทุกข์ง่ายสุขยากสุขง่ายทุกข์ยาก Okay, I think probably enough for this afternoon. Time to